lot of curve blocks in my quilting designs. And if you've never sewn curves before, it can be a little bit intimidating. I wanted to share today 2 ways that you can sew curves and learn to master them. The first method, which I think a lot of quilters use, is the pinning method. The second method that I'm going to share is the no pinning or the ease method for sewing Drunkard's Path blocks. The first thing that you want to remember whenever you're sewing curves is to take it slow. A lot of times we're so excited to get behind the machine that we end up going too fast. And just like driving a car, if you take the curve too quickly, you're not going to end up with good results. So keep it slow. Remember that you're sewing curves and you can speed up later on your straight blocks. Another thing that you want to remember is that you need to lift the fabric and gently manipulate it and don't pull it. You can see here I have a Drunkard's Path block already prepared. And when you cut the fabric for the L unit for your Drunkard's Path block, you'll notice that you've cut a curve. Now, what happens whenever you cut your fabric like this, it's almost like cutting your fabric on the bias, and you end up having a lot of stretch if you're not careful. So you want to gently lift and remember not to pull. Another thing that you can do to master curves is to use this strange attachment. Perhaps you've never seen this before. This is a knee lift, and it comes with a lot of standard sewing machines. Mine was packed away in the original sewing box for a long time, and I never knew what to do with it. And now it's become the attachment that I don't sew without. What you're doing is it attaches into your sewing machine, and then you take your knee and gently lift up against it, and it raises your presser foot whenever you're working. So that way it leaves your hands free, and you can move and manipulate your fabric under the machine without having to move your hands from the project. Another way that you can help against stretching and waves whenever you're sewing block is to use a light little layer of spray starch. You don't have to pay attention that it's a pure starch for this process, because it's not like the starch applique method that I talk about a lot. But a light layer of starch will give a little extra stability to your blocks whenever you're working with them. And another thing, if you're insecure of yourself, practice first. Don't put your good fabrics under the sewing machine and then be frustrated because you wasted your favorite fabric. Find a few scraps and start with practice. They don't say that practice makes perfect without a reason. Just practice first. And the last tip that I'm going to give before we move on to the next segment is to trim. It can be your best friend. I always trim all my Drunkard's Path blocks because I don't like to sew weighty blocks together. Whenever I'm sewing a perfectly cut square, it doesn't make sense to put a weighty block with it and try to manipulate it to make sure that it matches. So with a lot of my patterns, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Let's move over to the work table now. A couple things to mention before we move over to the sewing machine, especially if you're working with a PDF pattern, is you're going to make sure that you always check the control square to make sure that you've printed your templates to the right size. I use an A4 format in Germany, which might be different from letter size. Make sure that you're flipping over to your regular computer and select print to actual size before moving on. So when preparing the templates, you'll notice here that I have 2 different cutters. This first one is my regular cutter, which I use when I'm cutting fabrics. And then I have another cutter that is marked with a little band, so that way I know that this one can be used for paper. When I'm cutting my templates, I'm always using my paper cutter. Here I've actually cut the paper templates out ahead of time. And one thing, if you're a little concerned about using the templates over and over again, you can easily make a cardstock template and use the template multiple times. Here I've cut the L unit and the curve unit of the Drunkard's Path. When you're working with a Drunkard's Path block, you want to make sure that you put the L unit on top of the curved unit whenever you're sewing. So if you flip it around here and you turn your fabric over, you're going to do it right sides together, and this is how you're going to start a Drunkard's Path block.